And it really, for me, it's I send out $1. How quickly does that dollar come back and bring friends? So the first company, I think it took us about 3 years to get to $1 million a year. And then turn around the second company did it in like 14 months because we knew all the shortcuts.
Nobody does financial publishing the same way they did it in 2017, 2018, 2019, right? Anyone who's making money now is adapted at least some of these new philosophies or approaches. Welcome to Marketing from the Edge podcast. I'm Jon Alexander. I've directly generated over $200 million in net revenue over the last 5 years through innovative marketing and a numbers-first strategy. Join with me is my dad. Jon Alexander has become the go-to expert in the direct marketing field, generating over $1.5 billion in revenue over the last 5 years. Sought by both board of directors and nine-figure businesses, he is an owner/founder of Centurion Publishing and is on the journey of growing this brand new business from 0 to $100 million in annual revenue. Today, we're continuing the interview of my dad, Jon Alexander, on his secret to success in marketing. We'll dive into how he onboarded and then grew one of the most successful direct marketing businesses ever on the planet. Well, sending 5,000 letters in a month is very different than generating, 5,000 orders in a month or whatever it is.
Exactly. And one of the benefits of working on a small business, right, is typically most small businesses, especially in the direct response world, need to make money today, right?
Yeah.
Like most business owners don't have $1 million in the bank and they're like, okay, let's spend $1 million on marketing. If I can get it back in the next 12 months, that'd be awesome.
Yep. For lack of a better word, it's a simple problem you have to solve.
Yeah, exactly. And it really, for me, it's I send out $1. How quickly does that dollar come back and bring friends, right? That's it, right? That's basically marketing in a nutshell, direct response marketing. You're trying to get them off the ground. Some of them are zero, some are a couple $100,000 a year. And you're trying to number one, scale them, right? And work it backwards, right? Okay, what do you want to do? What do you want to build? How do we want to build it? Going through those things. And because I'd had businesses that worked really well, like the real estate. We had businesses that we bought and failed and imploded completely that we should have never bought, right? You learn 10 more from those than some of the other ones.
Yeah.
But because I watched my grandpa's a small business, right? I'd started small businesses. I'm an entrepreneur by nature. So it was easy to sit down and understand most business owners are emotional about their business. And when you step in like me to help somebody, I'm not emotional about the business, right? I didn't build it. It's not my baby, right? Some of these damn things look ugly. Right?
Yeah.
And so you step in and you're like, okay, in order to get to the outcome you want, these are the inputs that we need. And, I helped guys rebuild real estate investment companies, information businesses, a communication business, right? Worked in the IT field, all kinds of different fields. We're helping guys and literally just, okay, we're going to spend money on marketing. How much money are we going to spend? What is it going to generate for us? And then how do we take a part of that and turn it back in? And in every one of these businesses, you got to do something different, but you implement something, right? The real estate coaching business, right? We start the standard Kennedy model, to start a newsletter, turn it into a coaching program, turn it into a mastermind. Did that for him. And then he got to a point where he's like really happy with the revenue. So he ran off and did something else. And so the first company, I think it took us about 3 years to get to $1 million a year. And then turn around the second company did it in like 14 months because we knew all the shortcuts, right?
Yeah.
Like we knew how to speed up the process. We knew where you could do what you want to do. And that's what working in a bunch of different fields and doing this a bunch like I have, you just learn the shortcuts.
Right.
You learn the path to least resistance. It doesn't mean it always is perfect, right? Because, marketing's constantly changing.
Correct.
And the world's constantly changing and they're all different industries. So you got to learn the math for that industry. But once you get it, it's just math.
When you're under 10 million, usually you have like one or two funnels, right?
Yeah.
It is simple in a sense, but generally, in my experience at least, it's dysfunctional, right? Things are constantly breaking. It never works twice the same way. And like, no matter how many processes or things you put in place, it's almost like starting an engine cold every month.
Exactly.
And so it does not turn on, turn over, and hum perfectly. If you're a business owner, you know exactly what I'm talking about, right? Like as soon as you got one problem solved, another one pops right up. It's whack-a-mole every month, all month, probably every day, right? And going from this simple but dysfunctional structure, right? Eventually you work your way into, I'd consider it a struggling business, but they're doing what, $20-30 million annually. You have to then go and essentially build it all. I won't say from scratch, right? But like not a lot of infrastructure, not a lot of positive things going for it. And, I'd love to know, what did it look like stepping in there? Where did you start with that business? And the big question I think I would like to know is, what are the things you had to say no to, right? Like those things where you're like, man, that's either easy money, but you've got a bigger bucket to fill.
Yeah, that's a great question. So right before I went in the financial publishing space and went over to legacy research at the time, before I went there, I was helping a guy in the attorney space, the standard, how to make attorneys better, how to put marketing into place and make their practice better from that standpoint. And we did really well. We grew it. We were humming along. Things were going great. And then a buddy reaches out and he's like, hey, I just took over at Legacy. You got to come help me. And I'm like, got no desire to go help you, dude. I'm like, first of all, I don't want to move to Florida. And second of all, I got everything I need right here, right? Great business. But I prayed about it for a little while and felt led and like, okay, all right, here we go.
Yeah.
Let's run down here and do this thing. And I had always kind of talked to him on and off during the years. So from 2012 until 2017, when I eventually did go, I talked to him on and off. And he always used to just say over and over again, he's like, look, getting people on a webinar like we did in the real estate information days or all those other businesses, getting people on a webinar, whether it's 10 people or whether it's 10,000 like we do, it's the same damn thing.
Yeah.
And I'm like, all right, sure it is.
Yeah, give me 10,000 people.
Yeah. I mean, the math and the numbers just, when you're helping a company make 4 or 5 or 15 or 20 million bucks a year, right? That's real money. Like that's solid revenue numbers. Like most companies, most small businesses don't get to $1 million a year. Right. They pay the owner 30 to 50 grand a year, right? That's the average small business in this country. And you get there and you move into a niche that you're like, okay, we're in the financial publishing niche, financial newsletters to be specific. And holy crap, like this is a big niche, right?
Yeah.
These numbers just start to get a little ridiculous. And it doesn't really matter, right? Whether it's 100 million or a billion, it doesn't really make any difference. It's just a number. It's just math, right? It just gets reverse engineered the same way. At the end of the day, when you're marketing, whether you're marketing to 1 or 100,000, the reality is that it's still a human being at the end of that credit card number with a real issue and a real emotion and a real problem that they're trying to solve and they're looking to you to solve. It's still the same thing. Marketing's about psychology, which is why I love it so much, right? Because it's about human emotion. So when you step into these biggest, yes, there's some things about, okay, you can't turn around and send somebody a text and say, hey, what's your biggest question? Send us a text because you got 100,000 people, right? There's limitations and there's things that in broadcast marketing that you can't do in true, small business direct response marketing.
Right. It's one-to-one versus one-to-many.
Exactly. And sometimes you have to give up a little bit of the personal relationship in order to talk to the group, right?
Right.
And you still are doing the same things, right? You're still trying to touch on the emotional hot buttons. But now, so over the course of this 7 to 10 email sequence, I need to touch on these 6 emotions over the course of the sequence, as opposed to, hey, everybody's telling me this, and I can touch on the 2 emotions that they're feeling right now. I don't necessarily know. I just know that in a group of 100,000 people, 15% are going to feel this way and 15 this way and 15 this way.
You're trying to speak to a percentage of your audience, as opposed to in small business, you very much have the avatar.
Absolutely. For sure.
One to many, you don't have an avatar, right? You have audiences, right? And you have to be able to speak to them differently. But in a broadcast setting, you don't know what part of the audience they're in.
So true.
So you just have to be able to, meet them, right message, right audience, right time.
Well, and then you got, financial newsletters in general, you got to be careful about personalization, right?
Yeah.
So all the things that we know great work in marketing, like the word you, everybody loves you versus us or we, right? And, you can't do that, right? Hey, let's jump on a Q&A. I'll answer all your questions for you. Well, you can't technically do that, right?
Regulated.
It is. It is for a good reason. And so you have a list of rules that you have to abide by. And the reality is that list of rules, if you were a true pure marketer, you would violate every one of those rules, because we know that each one of those things works better if you do it. You got to be careful how you do surveys, because if you survey somebody, and here's a perfect simple example, is that you're like, hey, are you interested in gold or crypto? Right? And they click on either one. And what a great marketer would say, hey, here's the 7 things that I think are going to kick butt in the market this year. which one are you interested in? They'd click it. And oh, by the way, there'd be a product designed exactly in a funnel sequence for every one of those things.
Right.
You have personalized investment advice. And so, yes, so you have to survey like it's just, there's all kinds of nuance and rules that you end up learning in the financial space that ultimately in small business, like you talked about the big differences, those are really it, right? Those are the bigger things is, hey, in this space, right? In the financial space, prepper space, you can get away with a lot more stuff, right? The healthcare space, you get away with a lot less stuff.
I'd love almost a debrief, right? On you get onboarded at this company, right? I assume the first 90 days is almost like information overload. You were just trying to onboard yourself with as much context as possible, right?
Yeah. So let's just jump right there, right? So there's a couple things I wanted to touch on about getting on board, right? They'd actually plugged 3 companies together. I joined July 5th of 2017. I know how much money got made every year thereafter and what's happened in gross revenue.
Right.
But there's 2 things that stick out to me in that first period of time. For one, the CFO at the time, one of the smartest guys I've ever friggin' met, he comes up to me and he goes, look, one thing you're going to learn in this space is, because he was about 4 months, 5 months, maybe 6 months there before I was, is he's like, it just takes time to learn it. Give yourself some grace, right? Settle down. Because at the time I was still doing consulting on the side, which you show up, you talk to a guy for 2 hours on the phone, you show up and listen to an hour worth of problems in the morning, you provide solution set, here you go, right? That's consulting in a nutshell.
Right.
And I'm like, yeah, I'll be fine, right? There's no business you can't figure out in 3 hours, right? And holy shit, like you couldn't figure this business out in 30 days.
Yep.
It just took time, right? That's the one piece of advice I gave everybody after that I hired and brought on. Give yourself some grace. It just takes time. Second thing I remember is that I'd been there a week. I'm in there on a Saturday trying to learn and figure some of this stuff out. It started on Monday, right? I'm there on Saturday and the main publisher came in. We were the only 2 there in the office on Saturday. And she goes, how's it going? How's the first week or whatever? And I go, oh. So I think I've given like 3 sentences worth of coherent advice in a week. And she goes, it's pretty good. You've been here 5 days. That's pretty solid. And I'm thinking, like back to my consulting days, I'm like, man, like people pay you for your opinion and I've given literally 0 value in a week.
Right.
Maybe I'm in over my head. And spoiler alert, I wasn't. But shortly thereafter in that first year, a guy like me who was used to being in a small business and helping the owner to pick up every dime or dollar sitting around because they're all big.
Yeah.
Man, I saw so much freaking money being left on the wayside. So I had this conversation with the same head publisher and she asked something and I said, look, man, I look around and I see more money being left on the table than you guys are coming even close to picking up. And she's like, well, at least there's a lot of opportunity. That's better than the exact opposite. And I thought, she's absolutely right. Let's write them all down. Let's figure out where all the money sources are and let's go about picking them up.
You're getting onboarded. Then you get to a point where you come on and it wasn't what you didn't know. It's what you didn't know you didn't know. And I know that's confusing, right? But it's like it wasn't even the things where you're like, oh, I have to go in and learn this. It's all the things you didn't know you had to learn to be able to then competently be able to take that next step. So now you're onboarded, right? What was the pivot point for you going from, all right, I need to learn the business to learning the business and making meaningful strategic decisions to grow?
It pretty much was in that first 90 days, right? So I came in and, my job was to monetize the list.
Right.
So Fernando Cruz was the marketing director at the time. And Fernando's job, and he's who brought me on, right? He's like, I'll acquire, you monetize, right? Yep. We're going to acquire and then monetize. I acquire the names. You figure out how do we maximize and make money. And so, you got the webinar model. There's 1,000 ways you could do it, right? We chose to go down the webinar model. And so early on, you're putting these things in place. And every month, it just felt like there was one more piece of the puzzle you got. Like one more piece of the puzzle, one more thing. They were really wound up about making money every single month, much more like a cash small business, right?
Yeah.
Like, hey, we need to make X number of dollars by the end of the month. And so I remember in November, that first year, I put a webinar on November 2nd and CFO comes around on the 27th or 28th and he's like, holy shit, like we're not going to make money this month. And I'm like, what do you mean? Right? We got a webinar in 4 days. Yeah. He's like, well, that's November revenue. I'm like, well, what does that matter?
Yeah.
Like I'm trying to maximize the value of the company. And it became readily apparent that we had to maximize the value of the month because that's the way they looked at it.
This is tens of millions of dollars.
Yeah. That year we did, I don't think we got to 100 million, but pretty damn close, right?
Right.
And I'm like, well, shit, like that would have been a handy piece because I could have put the webinar on the 29th of October. Like I just chose November 2nd.
Right.
Right. It didn't matter. The October 25th. Like I'm not going to do it on Halloween, right? Or Game 7 of the World Series or the Super Bowl, right? There's certain days you're not going to do it on.
Right.
But for the most part, I'm like, these are just choices. Like, tell me what you want. And he's like, well, it'd be great if while we built a webinar, we actually made money. I'm like, sure, I can do that. Like, when the revenue machine doesn't have to stop just so we can go 5 or 7 days, right? Back in the old IM days where you watch those guys go for 3 weeks for one big payday. And I'm like, we don't have to do that. We have multiple businesses. Let's just market and do them differently. So there's all kinds of little things that stepped in. One of the first things I saw as we started to acquire more customers, right? And first of all, we're monetizing the shit out of the existing customers, which you can do for about 4 to 6 months.
Right.
Before you need new ones in.
Yeah, you can pull money out of your file.
Yeah, because most people are not doing it effectively. They're just not, right?
Right.
Almost any business I could walk into and for 4 to 6 months, I can pull more money out of your file than you're pulling out of it yourself.
Right.
That's just because I've got a tool belt with 72 friggin' ways to do it. Just ran this VSL. We ran it for 3 or 5 days. And I go, what do we do with it now? And they're like, well, nothing. It just ran. I go, yeah, but the guy that shows up next week, it's brand new to him. So what does he get? Well, 6 months from now, when we go to do another VSL, around that subject matter, then he'll get to, I'm like, why the hell would you do that? And so I'm like, why don't we just take and send these guys through that VSL?
That's an area where you can apply the one-to-one, right? It's like you look at someone and instead of looking at one-to-many, you're like, well, we already ran it to everyone. You're like, well, not this guy.
Yeah, exactly. Right? Not these guys that came on. And what about the guys that didn't open emails?
Right.
Right. What's your open rate? Well, 28%. Okay, well, shit. Like, I can guarantee you that even if you send him 5 emails, you hit 40% of the file, there's 60% of the file that never saw the damn email.
Well, and I think that's one of the biggest sins of small business is they'll have an email that's a winner, right? And they won't either automate it or bring it back or take that and continue to use that on the new audience, right?
Exactly.
They're like, well, we already ran that. Like, great, to those people, but what about these? One of the other things is a lot of people get hung up on like the exceptions, right? They're like, well, what if someone already saw it and then they get it again?
Yep.
Chances are that's going to happen. You know,
exactly.
like you do enough business, things are going to happen that are unintended.
Then you get the famous line like, well, we're over marketing then.
Oh,
really? Like,
don't get me started on over marketing.
Who decides what's over marketing? Well, as us sitting there who sees every single email and every single thing that goes out, yeah, maybe you're right. But as that customer that sits there, that doesn't open every email, that doesn't see everything, or even if they do, they decide when you overmarket by opting out of your friggin' list.
Right.
Or ignoring your emails.
Well, do some people want marketing?
Exactly.
You know, you're like, whoa, email?
I know. And others, you know, if a guy sends me 10 a day, I'm probably going to pay attention.
You'd rest.
You rest the list. That's the word I was listening for. And I go, well, you think he's only on your list? I go, I guarantee you that if this guy's buying financial newsletters, he's on their list and their list and their list and their list. And if he's not now, if you're going to run affiliate offers, eventually you're going to put him on their list and their list and their list. So all you're really doing is deciding, hey, you know what, guys, we just don't want to make any money today. That's what we're going to do.
That's another one of the big sins is thinking about you and your customer are in a vacuum. And you're not.
You're not. If a guy is interested, right? If you think about biz op marketing, just for an example, those guys tend to have an issue. They need solved. They raise their head for about 90 days and try 6 or 7 or 8 different things. Chances are very few of them actually work. They feel like they accomplished something because they tried 6 or 7 or 8 different things, and then they stick their head in the sand
another
again
problem that was bigger arose.
Exactly, right?
Move on.
But typically people look for multiple solutions to a single problem, especially in the internet days now. Like, you're not the only one showing up in the email or in the inbox or in the text message.
And more than just solution, it's like people are looking for opportunities, right?
Yep.
And that's why when you think it's like, oh, well, they'll only buy us, or like a lot of people are looking for opportunities, because if they were only buying a solution, they would find one, right? But like when you go and you're like, hey, I need to lose weight, you might buy 2 or 3 things that help you accomplish that, right? Because the end goal is bigger than your quote solution, right? They're buying the opportunity to lose weight through this vehicle or through that vehicle or through that, right? Whether it's supplements or a special piece of gear, you know, the clothing they wear, whatever it may be, same thing. You're not in a vacuum, right? there's a lot of things happening all at once in their life, and you're a part of that series of things.
Exactly.
So just walk me through one of the funnels, and we can go as vague or specific as you want. But when you go from kind of like managing a funnel to building, right? Like, hey, this is a strategic initiative I'm creating. What was one of those first like kind of big strategic objectives you pushed forward?
So I'll tell you, right? So the biggest thing that got us moving faster than everybody else was, for one, so when you step in and you got a business that's going to make, whatever, 70 to 100 million bucks a year, right? Typically you have to build credibility, right? So I built relationships. That's what I did. I went down and talked to the copywriters and let them understand, look, guys, it wasn't too long ago. I'm writing 60-page sales letters. I just chose marketing because I'd rather do this, right?
Yep.
And one thing Fernando was like, you got to work in marketing for 3 years before you can go to copy.
Yeah.
I'm like, okay. But you got to build relationships and you got to go through the process of doing, right? And so one of the things, though, is that once I kind of got some goodwill, some credibility under my thing, as we look towards the end of that first year, I'm like, wait a second, right? So we lose money on what we called the front end, right? On the acquisition of the client, we lost money, $100 to $150. And in order to try to make it up by selling him a second product.
Right.
And, it was pretty easy. It's just math, right? If you acquire a customer and you lose $100, so just use simple math, and your turnaround and your average sale on the back end is $2,000. So you need to convert 1 out of 20 guys to buy a $2,000 product because you lost $2,000 just to break even, right?
Yeah.
Like it seems very straightforward to me. So I'm like, okay, well, if that's the job, right? If we have these front end names coming in, we need to convert 5% to a back end. How are they converting? And if we're not converting 1 out of 20, well, then why are we acquiring that customer? So acquire those customers that you can monetize. You don't acquire and then worry about monetizing. You acquire customers that you are monetizing.
Goes
you
back
can monetize.
to beginning with the end in mind.
Exactly. And so I looked at all of our stuff and looked at a lot of the stuff I had to get built. And I'm going, yeah, everybody in the day in 2017 and all the way into 18 and some into 19 they'd converted every newsletter subscription on the front to a book offer. They're like, hey, we'll sell them a book and attach a newsletter to it. And right off the bat, I go, those aren't newsletter buyers. Those are book buyers that you're now trying to sell a newsletter.
Right.
And right off the bat on all those promos, I'm like, yeah, it's great that you acquire 1,000 friggin' book buyers, but they convert at 2% and you lose $100 on every one.
Right.
Like you're losing money. So we shut ours down nearly within the first 6 months of 2018, we were completely out of the book offer business.
Well, that's because, one, those offers, I assume, are really easy to scale.
They're
right?
great. So yeah, you're selling a book. You're convincing somebody to spend $20 on a book, right? Like people are used to buying books.
Right.
And so, yes, they're easy to scale. And by the way, we're going to attach a 12-month newsletter to it. Well, you didn't have to sell the newsletter. You sold the book.
Right. And then,
yeah, they're like, what newsletter?
Yeah.
I didn't know I bought one in the first place because it was a bolt-on to what I got, right?
Yeah. As opposed to selling the solution and then bolting on what they want, right? Give them what they want, sell them what they need.
And that's because every financial publishing business, and I say nearly every one, at least all the ones that I knew of at the time, were acquiring and then monetizing.
Yeah.
They didn't put the two together. They didn't acquire those that they could monetize. One department was in charge of acquiring. A whole nother department was in charge of monetizing. And if these guys weren't getting enough names on the front end, they got yelled at. If these guys weren't making enough money, they got yelled at.
Well, I'm sure there was no communication between the two, right?
There was very little because
other than, like you said, when someone wasn't doing their job, they're like, hey, what
because back in 2010 and 2012 and 2014 and in the newsletter business back then, you acquired a bunch of customers and then you spent the next 12 months monetizing. That's the way it worked.
Right.
But in 2017, when the world was changing, right, it didn't make any sense. Like, hey, we can spend our best marketing dollars if we know which of those names are actually going to buy a back end, then we scale those up. And then, oh, by the way, you eventually break it into, okay, which channel scales? And then within which channel, which particular promo is scaling. So you ultimately granularize it once you get that far.
So I want to talk a little bit about acquiring to monetize as opposed to monetizing the acquired names. So I'm privy to this, but in 1 month, you spent better than $17 or what was it? $15 million.
Oh, it was 17 million. We spent $17 million on acquisition.
And for the majority of businesses, that's more than their entire annual gross revenue you spent in 1 month. And, I assume you didn't lose money on that. So how'd you pull that off, right? Like, what is the anatomy behind spending $17 million and profiting?
So now I got to get back to the next stage of any business, right? We'll just talk about the financial publishing business of my story, right? You get back to the next stage, which is like, okay, great. Now we're acquiring. Now we're monetizing. Now, when you start to build multiple monetization events, right? You're like, okay, well, we could do one webinar a quarter, major monetization event. What if we did 2 a month, right? Will the list support 2 a month, right? And you just figure out which the list supports. So that's one thing. The second thing is these guys, from the heyday of the financial publishing business all the way up into when we were messing with it, I heard over and over again, it takes 90 days to make your money back. And I'm like, why does it take 90 days to make your money back? Well, that's just the way it works, right?
Right.
And I'm like, that doesn't make any sense. Why don't we just get our money back faster? I'm a small business background, right? Like if a business spends $1 million this month, they need that $1 million back because he didn't have $1 million in the bank.
That was a number, again, based off of acquiring, then monetizing.
Exactly.
Right? They're like, if this is how much it costs us to acquire a customer.
Yep, exactly. They go, look, it just takes time to recoup that $100, right? I'm just using 100.
Right.
Obviously, that's not what the math really was. The point is, it takes time to recoup that money.
Right.
Like, okay, well, so that's the problem, right? Again, figure out problem, create solution. Okay, it takes time to recoup the money. Well, why don't we just shorten the time period up? Hey, why don't we actually track the damn time period, right? Yep. I'm going to butcher the story, but the gist of it is that, and I think it was the steel business, that they had all these consultants to try to get more productivity out of the workers, more productivity out of the workers. And eventually somebody walked in and said, hey, I can get more productivity out of the 2 shifts, right? And so what he did is he got a piece of chalk and he came in, and right before the second shift came in after the first shift, he put a big number on the bottom on how much they did, right? He put a 4 on the ground. And so second shift came in. Well, they're naturally competitive. So they scratched that thing out. When the morning shift came in the next day, 4.5 is on the ground. They scratch that out. They get 5. Eventually, they doubled productivity on each of the shifts, literally by keeping score.
Yeah.
Right. And letting the other person know what the score is. I mean, go figure, right? Instead of keeping it to yourself.
Yeah.
And so that's why, like, I always shared with my team what gross revenue was all the time, right? Keeping score, right? What's the scoreboard look like? But that same concept, when you're like, okay, if it takes 90 days to break even, well, how do we get it to 60? Well, we can do this. Okay, well, how do we get it to 40? Right? Why don't we just keep tracking what each of these promos takes to break even, what it takes us to eventually get to a break even point that makes sense for how much we want to spend? Because, you hear it all the time, like, who couldn't pay more money to acquire a customer wins, right? That's a very simplified version and way of looking at it. Because the reality is that I could have used 90 as the number. And as we figured out how to acquire more money faster, we could have just raised how much money we were spending to acquire customers and use 90 as the same number. We chose to do the exact opposite. We're like, okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to pull this number back and get it down in the 7 to 10 day range, right? At one point, it was literally 1 day, but get it down in the 7 to 13 day range. We're super comfortable around 7 to 13 days. And what we did was we allowed that to determine how much money we could spend on a promotion because this is what we wanted to do as a business. We want to break even between day 7 and 13. So if between day 7 and 13, you're going to get $200 back. Well, you can add $200 onto whatever they're going to pay you on the front end to create your cost to acquire the customer, right?
Right.
And then you're like, okay, well, maybe we get the customers to spend more money on the front end. Okay, well, shit, now we get to double that, right?
Yeah.
So anyways, that's just how we tracked it. That's what we did. We looked at the problem on how to get here. That month in January 21, we were killing it. We had great promotions that were working. When we got to that point, we got the 7 to 13 day point, we decided, we basically had no marketing budget. We allowed those promos to scale that did this, right? We looked at it completely different than everybody else. You don't sell $1.5 billion in newsletters in 5 years if you don't do something different than what everybody else in the industry is doing.
Yep.
That was one of the ways we looked at it. We looked at it here. We're like, hey, this is the number. This is how we're going to get there. We don't have a marketing budget as long as those numbers hit. So any promo that would scale and would work within those parameters, we spend as much money out in the marketplace as we could afford to spend.
So the truth is it wasn't that you were spending $17 million in that month. It was that you were spending $5 million every 7 days.
That's exactly. So when you look at it like that, yeah, you didn't have to have $17 million that you got back 30 days or $17 million you got back in 7 days. You had to have $4 million so you could rework that $4 million and rework it. And you just get to use that same dollar over and over again.
Yeah.
And we basically got to the point where we were spending, most months we'd spend $2.5, $3 million on marketing spend because we were getting it all back. If you go 90 days and you're going to spend $2 million a month and you're not going to get it back for 90 days, you need $6 million in the bank, right? If you want to spend $2 million, you're going to get it back in 7 days. You need $500,000 in the bank.
Yep.
Whole different story.
I remember specifically, we had this conversation one Friday during one of our meetings we used to have. And I kind of brought up this idea of like net exposure. Your marketing budget isn't how much you're going to spend, it's how much exposure you have. To the point of, hey, your marketing budget, it wasn't necessarily unlimited, right? It was just that your exposure was so low that, there was almost no amount of money you could spend to where you would lose money, right?
Exactly. And it's one of those things that when you're in a highly competitive field, right? Financial publishing, and you're all going after the same audience, right? We're part of Agora, right? Agora's got multiple brands and multiple stuff. I'm sure at some point we'll talk about Agora because most of the people who talk about Agora never actually worked at Agora and they don't know what the hell they're talking about, right?
Or at least not at the level.
Not that we did. But when you're looking across that, right? And Agora, we shared everybody. Everybody knew what everybody else was making gross revenue and what was working. And everybody knew which promotions everybody else was running, right?
There are no secrets, really.
There wasn't, right? There wasn't a whole lot, which is good. But when you're at that level, right, and you're within that world, I would see all the time where they'd run a promo and they'd say like, hey, will you support our promotion?
Yeah.
Especially on front end acquisition stuff. Would you support our promotion? I'm like, okay, what are you paying for a CPA? How much are you going to pay me for every customer I send your way? Right. And they're like, well, I'll pay you $250. I'm like, and I knew in the back of my mind, I'm like, you can't do that. Right.
Yeah.
Why did they pay $250? Well, everybody else was paying $250. I'm like, the stupidest reason ever to do anything.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, it's acquire to acquire.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Right. So they go, well, that's what everybody's paying. Well, yeah, but your promo isn't converting or working nearly as well as everybody else's. So you can't pay as much money. So when you talk about net exposure, you talk about an unlimited marketing budget or anything else, right? We allowed the promotion to scale at the level the promotion is going to scale at the amount of money we wanted to spend. It didn't matter what everybody else did. Hell, most of the time, I didn't pay attention to another soul across financial publishing because they're all friggin' eating each other's lunch and just, working off each other. We just stuck our head down and built an entirely different system to the point where they didn't really understand what we were doing, but they're like, you guys are paying $300 CPA. I guess we're all paying $300 now. Like, that doesn't make any sense.
It's one of the most interesting things ever, right? Is this idea that while everyone else is essentially self-replicating over and over and over and over and just becoming a 1% better version of themselves or of themselves by being the same as their competitor, right? Then you guys sit down and you find a new way to approach business that completely, really did change the game. Nobody does financial publishing the same way they did it in 2017, 2018, 2019, right? Anyone who's making money now is adapted at least some of these new philosophies or approaches. So
at least some of them, right?
I would say the majority. There are definitely some people who brute force it and you can make money.
No, I'm just saying so of all the things that we did at Legacy, many of them, they were just too complex for most people to do, right? So here's a prime example of one and the reason why I say this is that at its peak, right, of when we were allowing the company to scale whatever the company was going to scale and however it was going to work,
right?
We had a monster year. I had a marketing department of 99 people. And everybody looked at me across the Agora was like, you're a friggin' nut job, right? They're like, you only need 7 guys to market. I'm like, well, yeah, the way you do it, you need 7 guys. What we chose to do and allow the business to go to whatever the business is going to go. I used to tell everybody we were in a building, an office environment, obviously in the 2019 and 20 ranges, we were really starting to scale. And they're like, where are we going to put the people? I'm like, we're not going to allow a building to determine what size company we're going to have. It's the stupidest thing in the world. right? When people look at things like that, they're like, well, how hard is it to work? Or where are we going to put the person? Or what? Like, those are all limiting beliefs.
Yeah.
Right. I'm like, we'll double stack the stack. We'll double stack the desks. Like, what's the matter?
Desks.
Yeah.
You're allowing operations to dictate your business.
Exactly. Which is the stupidest thing ever, right? Same reason why when we created a date on a calendar, we held to it. They're like, well, the operations team's struggling. Well, then figure it out. Right. We're not changing the date because you guys can't do something. That doesn't make any sense in the world. Right. We're not letting the tail wag the dog.
Yeah.
Right. This is what we're trying to accomplish. And this is where we're going. And this is what we're going to allow it to do. And again, most people didn't want to do that. Right. I knew how to run a team that had 99 friggin' people on it. Right. Most of these guys, they're comfortable with 7. They stay in their comfort factor.
Yeah.
They don't have to risk anything.
It's a different skill set being
Absolutely.
a marketer as opposed to a leader, and being a leader of leaders.
You've been listening to Marketing from the Edge podcast. If you want to hear more of our thoughts every week, visit marketingedgepod.com. We'll share more of our very best lessons, thoughts, and strategies for growing a business, as well as some personal stories here from the edge of the world. Invest a couple minutes of your morning and we'll give you the blueprint to growing your business from where it's at today to where you want it to be. That's marketingedgepod.com. If you want to reach out to us directly, feel free to email Cody, CODY, at marketingedgepod.com, and you might even get a surprise bonus. Next week is the final segment of my interview of my dad, Jon Alexander, on his secret to success in marketing. We'll show how he unlocked billion-dollar revenue strategies and his startup blueprint, including first steps and growth strategies.